The morning Nellie Cooper found the first horse tied to her gate. She stood on her porch in her worn cotton nightgown. Flour still dusted across her forearms from the bread she'd been kneading since before dawn, and thought that the world had gone entirely mad. It was the spring of 1878 in the Colorado Territory, a land still raw and unfinished, where the red dirt roads dissolved into nothing a few miles past town, and the mountains to the west looked like the spine of some enormous sleeping creature. Harlow Creek was the kind of settlement that wasn't quite a town yet, but was trying desperately to become one, with its one dry goods store, its post office that doubled as a dentist's office, its modest church whose bell had cracked during the previous winter and now produced a sound more like a groan than a ring, and its scattering of homesteads spread out across the valley like seeds tossed carelessly from a giant hand. Nellie had come to Harlow Creek 3 years ago with her husband, Thomas Cooper, who had believed with the absolute and unshakable conviction of a man who had never actually farmed a day in his life that the Colorado soil would make them rich. Thomas had been wrong about that. Thomas had been wrong about a great many things, as it turned out, including the strength of his own heart, which had given out on him 14 months ago on a Tuesday afternoon while he was trying to pull a fence post from the ground. He had been 34 years old. Nellie had been 27. She had buried him herself, with the help of her neighbor Josephine Hadley and the preacher who smelled perpetually of tobacco. And then she had walked back to the house that Thomas had built with his own 2 somewhat incompetent hands, sat down at the kitchen table, and decided that she was not going to leave. That decision had cost her everything she had in terms of pride and stubbornness and sheer physical endurance, but 14 months later, she was still there. The house was modest but solid. She kept 2 milk cows, a small flock of chickens, a kitchen garden that she tended with religious devotion, and 1 old plow horse named August who was about as fast as a Wednesday afternoon and twice as stubborn. She sold butter and eggs to the dry goods store in town, took in mending and laundry when she could get it, and generally scraped by with the particular grim efficiency of a woman who has learned that survival is simply a series of small decisions made one after another. She was 29 years old, lean and brown from working outdoors, with dark hair she kept pinned away from her face and green eyes that people tended to remember long after they had forgotten everything else about her. She was not unhappy, exactly. She was something more complicated than unhappy. She was a woman who had put grief away like a piece of furniture in a back room and was getting on with the business of living. And then, on a Tuesday morning in April, there was a horse tied to her gate. Not just any horse. A beautiful roan mare with a white blaze down her face, already saddled with a clean, well-oiled saddle, tied neatly to the gate post with a good length of rope. She stood there in the early morning light with the patience of an animal that had been well treated and well trained, her ears swiveling gently, her tail moving in slow, unhurried sweeps. There was no note. There was no explanation. There was simply the horse, standing there as though she had grown out of the Colorado dirt overnight. Nellie looked at the horse for a long time. Then she looked up and down the road. The valley was empty and quiet, the way it always was at that hour, with only the distant sound of a meadowlark carrying across the flat land. She walked down to the gate in her nightgown and bare feet, stopping just short of the animal, who turned her large dark eyes toward Nellie with an expression of dignified patience. "Well," Nellie said to the horse, "I don't know who you belong to." The horse did not offer any information. Nellie untied the mare and led her to the small corral beside the barn, gave her water and some of the precious hay she had been rationing for August, and then went back to her bread. She made inquiries in town that afternoon, asking at the store and at the post office, and even stopping the 2 ranchers she passed on the road home, and no one claimed the horse. No one had heard anything about a missing roan mare. No one had any explanation whatsoever. She went asleep that night half expecting the horse's owner to show up and demand her back. Instead, the next morning, there was a different horse at her gate. This one was a big bay gelding, calm and steady, again saddled and tied with good rope, again with no note or explanation. Nellie stood on her porch and stared at him for a full minute before she pressed her lips together in a thin, determined line and went down to deal with him. By the end of the first week, Nellie had 7 horses in and around her corral, which was becoming something of a crisis. The animals were all fine specimens, all well-fed and well-mannered, all arriving each morning before dawn as though delivered by some particularly horse-minded spirit. August regarded his new companions with the profound indifference of an animal who had reached the age of philosophical detachment. The chickens were considerably more unsettled. Josephine Hadley, who lived about 2 miles down the road and made it her business to know everything that happened in the valley, came by on Friday afternoon and stood at Nellie's fence with her arms crossed and her eyebrows somewhere near her hairline. 7 horses, Josephine said. 7 horses, Nellie confirmed. In a week. In 6 days, actually. Josephine was 52 years old, built like a woman who had not had time in her life to be anything other than substantial, with iron-gray hair and a manner of looking at the world that suggested she had seen most of it and found it mildly disappointing but not surprising. She turned and looked at the assembled horses as though she were conducting an official audit. "They're good animals," she said finally. "They are," Nellie agreed. "Someone with real knowledge picked them out." "That's what I think too." Josephine turned back to her. "You haven't got any idea who it is. None at all." This was not entirely true. Nellie had one very faint idea, but she was not yet ready to share it, partly because she wasn't certain enough to say it out loud, and partly because saying it out loud would require her to have some kind of feeling about it, and she was not at all sure she was prepared for whatever feeling that might be. The faint idea had to do with a man named Roy Boone. Roy Boone had come through Harlow Creek about 2 months ago, drifting down from the north the way men did in the territory, carrying everything he owned in his saddlebags and a bedroll behind his saddle. He was roughly 30 years old, she supposed, though he had the kind of face that could have belonged to a man anywhere between 25 and 35, weathered in a way that was not unpleasant, with dark brown eyes that caught the light in a way she had noticed entirely against her will. He was tall enough to stand out in a room and quiet enough that you sometimes forgot he was there, which created an odd combination that Nellie had found, again entirely against her will, somewhat compelling. He had ridden up to the Harlow Creek livery stable and quietly announced himself as a man who knew horses and was looking for work. By some considerable stroke of fortune, old Pete Brannigan, who ran the livery, had broken his wrist on a particularly uncooperative mule 2 weeks prior and was in desperate need of someone who could actually manage the business. Roy Boone had been hired inside of an hour. He had been sleeping in the loft of the stable ever since and had, in the 2 months since his arrival, become the sort of person that the town acknowledged without really noticing, the way you acknowledge a good fence post or a reliable water pump. He was simply there, doing his work, not causing any trouble. Nellie had spoken to him exactly 4 times. The first time was when she had brought August in to be shod, and Roy had done the work with such quiet efficiency that she had found herself watching him from the doorway of the livery, which she told herself was simply because she was waiting to see that August behaved himself. The second time was when she had passed him on the road, and he had touched the brim of his hat and said, "Afternoon," in a way that somehow used exactly as many words as the situation required and no more. The third time was at Josephine's Sunday supper, where he had appeared as a charity case of sorts, invited because Josephine believed that men who ate alone too often eventually became problems for the community, and he had sat at the end of the table and eaten his food and answered when he was spoken to and helped carry dishes back to the kitchen at the end of the evening without being asked. The fourth time was at the dry goods store, where their hands had both reached for the same sack of cornmeal on the shelf at the same moment, and they had both stopped and looked at each other, and she had said, "Go ahead," and he had said no, please, and she had taken it, and he had stepped back, and that had been that. 4 encounters. Enough to form an impression, not enough to form a conclusion. And yet here were the horses. On the 8th day, a thought occurred to Nellie that she had been avoiding. The horses were good animals and they needed proper care. And if she was going to keep them, even temporarily, she needed feed she could not afford. On the 9th day, she rode the roan mare into town for the first time, partly because August was tired and partly because she needed to test whether the mare was as good as she looked, and partly, she admitted to herself somewhere around the halfway point of the 2-mile journey, because she wanted Roy Boone to see her on the horse and perhaps understand that she was taking care of it. The roan moved beautifully. She was responsive and smooth, with good ground-covering strides that made the journey feel like nothing at all. Nellie arrived in town feeling better than she had in months, which annoyed her. She tied the mare outside the dry goods store and was coming out with her purchases when she nearly walked directly into Roy Boone, who was coming from the direction of the livery with a bridle slung over his shoulder. He stopped. She stopped. The roan mare, tied to the post, turned her head and looked at him with what Nellie could only describe as recognition. Roy Boone looked at the horse for a moment. Then he looked at Nellie. He said nothing. His face did not change in any dramatic way, but there was something there, something she couldn't quite name, like the moment before a storm when the air shifts and you know something is about to be different. "Nice horse," he said. "She is," Nellie said. He touched the brim of his hat and walked on. That evening, Nellie stood at her kitchen window and watched the horses moving quietly in the corral in the last light of the day. And she thought about Roy Boone's face when he had looked at the roan, and she thought that she was beginning to understand what was happening, and she was not sure what to do with that understanding. On the 14th day, there was a new horse at her gate, a dun-colored mare with excellent conformation and the alert eyes of an animal bred for working cattle. And beside the horse, wedged under the rope that tied it to the post, was a small folded piece of paper. Nellie's heart did something involuntary when she saw it. She unfolded it with hands that were steadier than she felt. It said, in handwriting that was careful but unpracticed, the writing of a man who had not done much of it, "Her name is Clover. She is easy with fences." That was all. No signature, just the note. Nellie stood there in the morning light with that small piece of paper in her hand, and felt something she had not felt in a very long time. Something she did not immediately have a name for, something warm and complicated and slightly frightening, like putting your hand near a fire after being cold for a long time and not being entirely sure whether it was going to burn you or simply warm you up. She kept the note. She folded it and put it in the small wooden box on her dresser where she kept Thomas's watch and her mother's ring, and the other small things that mattered. On the 15th day, she told herself she was going to go to town and simply ask Roy Boone what exactly he thought he was doing. She told herself this with great conviction. Then she did not go to town. On the 16th day, she told herself the same thing with equal conviction. Then she baked a pie instead, which she told herself was coincidental. On the 17th day, there was a paint horse at her gate with a note that said "Good in water crossings." No fear of it. And Nellie sat down on the porch step in the early morning with the note in her hand and looked at the horses, all of them quiet and healthy and inexplicably hers, and laughed for the first time in a long time. It was a short laugh, and she put her hand over her mouth immediately after it escaped, but it was real and it left something lighter in her chest where something heavy had been for a considerable while. She was not a woman who believed in making things easy for herself. She had learned, through the long school of experience, that things which came easily often cost you later in ways you hadn't anticipated. But she was also, and this was something she was only recently beginning to remember about herself, a woman who knew what she felt. And what she felt, looking at those horses, reading those small, careful notes, was something that Thomas Cooper, God rest him, would have called smitten, and then laughed, and then squeezed her hand, because Thomas, for all his failures as a farmer, had been a kind and generous-hearted man who would not have wanted her to spend the rest of her life alone. On the 22nd day, a woman named Clara Briggs, who was the wife of the town's most prosperous rancher, and who had opinions about everything with the force and regularity of a well-wound clock, came to call on Nellie under the pretense of borrowing a pattern for a dress. Clara sat at Nellie's kitchen table, looked out the window at the 12 horses currently in and around Nellie's small corral, and said, "People are talking, Nellie." "What are they saying?" Nellie asked, setting tea in front of her. "They're saying Roy Boone has been leaving horses at your gate every morning before dawn," Clara said. "Old Pete Brannigan's wife saw him leaving town with a horse 2 weeks ago before sunup and asked him about it, and he just said good morning and kept riding." Nellie said nothing. She sat down across from Clara with her own tea. "He's a drifter," Clara said, in the gentle but inexorable tone of a woman delivering what she believes to be important information. "No land, no money to speak of, no people anyone knows of. He has a good job at the livery," Nellie said. "Old Pete thinks well of him." "Old Pete thinks well of anyone who can lift things he can no longer lift," Clara said, not unkindly. "I'm just saying, Nellie, you've worked very hard to keep yourself decent and independent these past 14 months. A man who leaves horses instead of calling properly, well, what does that say about him?" Nellie thought about the notes. The careful, unpracticed handwriting. "Her name is Clover. She is easy with fences," the specificity of it. The fact that he had known exactly what a widow woman alone on a homestead might need to know about a horse before she trusted it. "I think," Nellie said slowly, "that it says he is a man who is not sure he will be well received and is making an argument before he makes an appearance." Clara stared at her for a moment. Then she picked up her tea. "Well," Clara said, "that is a generous interpretation." "I am generally a generous woman," Nellie said. This was not true, and they both knew it, and they both smiled a little into their tea. On the 25th day, Nellie did something that surprised her somewhat. She rose earlier than usual, before even her chickens had begun their morning commentary, and she went to sit on the porch step in the dark, wrapped in her shawl, and she waited. She was not entirely sure what she expected to see. Or rather, she was entirely sure what she expected to see, but she was pretending to herself that she wasn't. The sky was still that deep blue-black of 4 in the morning, the stars brilliant and enormous the way they only are in high, dry places far from any city, and the valley below her small house was perfectly still and perfectly silent. She heard him before she saw him. The soft sound of hooves on the dirt road, careful and quiet, the pace of someone trying not to wake anyone. Then the darkness produced a shape, a man on horseback leading a second horse behind him, moving along the road that ran in front of her property with the unhurried certainty of someone who had made this particular journey many times. He did not see her. She was still and quiet on the porch step, wrapped in her dark shawl, and the night was around her like a blanket. She watched him come to the gate, swing down from his horse with the economy of movement that characterized everything he did, and tie the new horse to the post with what she could see, even in the dark, was a properly executed knot. He took a moment to check the tie, to run his hand down the horse's neck in a brief gesture of reassurance, and then he stood there for just a moment, looking at the house, looking at where she was sitting without knowing she was there. He had no idea she was watching him. And because he didn't know, what she saw was entirely unguarded. The way he stood there in the dark and looked at her house with an expression she couldn't see clearly but whose quality she could somehow feel anyway, something quiet and patient and hopeful, the way a man looks at something he wants very much but has not allowed himself to hope for too freely. He stood there for no more than 10 or 15 seconds. Then he turned, mounted his horse, and rode back in the direction of town. Nellie sat on her porch step for a long time after he disappeared. The stars wheeled slowly overhead. The new horse at the gate stood patiently in the pre-dawn quiet. Eventually, one of the roosters started up his business, and the rest of the world began to wake. and Nellie rose from the step and went to untie the horse and thought about that unguarded expression that she had only been able to feel rather than see, and she thought that she was done waiting. On the 26th day, she went to town. She rode the roan mare, whose name she had come to think of as Rose even though the note had not given her a name, and she tied her in front of the livery stable and walked in through the wide doors into the smell of hay and horses and leather, and the particular peaceful dimness of a well-run barn. Roy Boone was at the far end, checking the hooves of a big sorrel gelding, and he straightened and turned at the sound of her footsteps with the wariness of a man who has learned that unexpected visitors usually mean unexpected problems. When he saw it was her, he went very still. "Mrs. Cooper," he said. "Mr. Boone," she said. She stopped about 10 feet from him and looked at him steadily, the way she looked at everything when she had decided to be honest about it. "I have 25 horses." He didn't say anything. He turned the farrier's tool he had been using over slowly in his hands. 25 horses is a considerable number of horses," she said. "For a woman with a small corral, 1 milk cow barn, and approximately $40 in savings." He was watching her with those dark brown eyes that caught the light. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "I expect it is." "My question," Nellie said, "is why?" There it was. The direct thing she had been building toward, the question that had been sitting in her chest for 25 days. She watched him take it in. She watched something move across his face. Something she had a feeling he didn't show very often, because men like Roy Boone generally preferred to be inscrutable, and because the world had generally treated inscrutable men better than the other kind. He looked down at the tool in his hands for a moment. Then he looked back up at her. "Because," he said, and his voice was careful the way his handwriting was careful, the same deliberate attention to getting it right. "Because I did not know how else to tell you that I have been thinking about you every day since I came to this town, and I did not know if you would want to hear it, and I thought if I could show you first, something useful, something that might make things easier for you, then maybe you would know I was not just saying words." The livery stable was very quiet. The sorrel gelding blew softly through his nose. Outside, a wagon went rattling down the street and somebody called out a greeting to someone else, and the whole ordinary morning went on as though nothing significant was happening. "Why horses?" she asked. Something changed in his expression then, a very slight relaxing, as though that particular question was one he was glad she had asked rather than afraid of it. "Because I know horses," he said simply. "It's the thing I'm best at, and because you need them. You have one old horse and a piece of land that wants working, and I thought if she had good horses she could do more. She could sell, or work more ground, or at least ride somewhere that wasn't too hard on her back." He paused. "August is a good soul, but he is about done." Nellie made a sound that was almost a laugh. "He is," she agreed. "And because," Roy continued, and now his voice dropped slightly, the way voices do when they are approaching the real thing, "because every morning I took one out there I would stand at that gate for a little while, and I felt close to something I have not felt close to in a very long time, and I know that is probably not a proper reason for anything, but it is the truth." She looked at him for a long moment, the flower on her apron, the hat in his hands which he had taken off at some point without her noticing. The way he was standing, neither defensive nor pleading, just there and honest about it, which she suspected was the best and hardest thing a person could offer another person. "You could have called," she said, "like a normal man." "I know it," he said. "I am not always a normal man." "No," she said, "I can see that." She turned and walked to the stable door and stopped there. The morning light was coming in from outside, warm and golden, the kind of April light that makes the whole world look like an apology for winter. "I make supper at 6 o'clock," she said, without turning around. "If you would like to come and eat it." She walked out without waiting for his answer. He came at 5 minutes to 6, which told her something right there, because a man who arrives 5 minutes early to something he wants to arrive at is a man who has been watching the clock since mid-afternoon, and has only just barely managed to not arrive an hour early. He stood on her porch with his hat in his hands, and she opened the door and looked at him. And for the first time they were in the same place with nothing between them. No stable half-darkness, no road, no gate with a horse at it, just the two of them and the warm smell of the supper she had been cooking, and the evening light going orange and gold across the valley behind him. "Come in," she said. He came in. He was larger in her house than she had expected, not because he was an especially large man, but because her house was small and she had been the only person in it for 14 months. He stood in the middle of her kitchen and looked at the table she had set for two, and at the cast iron pot on the stove, and at the jar of wildflowers she had put on the table that afternoon, and then looked immediately away from as soon as she caught herself doing it. "Smells good," he said. "Sit down," she said. "I'll pour you some coffee." They sat across from each other at the small table and ate her stew and her cornbread, and they talked. Not the way she had half imagined they might talk, not carefully and awkwardly with long silences, but really talked, the way you talk when you have been quietly curious about someone for a long time and suddenly have permission to be curious out loud. She learned that he was 31 years old, that he had grown up on a cattle ranch in New Mexico territory, that his father had been a rancher and his mother had been a schoolteacher from Ohio who had come west as a young woman and never looked back. He had 2 older brothers, both still in New Mexico, and a sister in Kansas who had married a grain merchant. He had been working with horses since he was old enough to be useful, had spent several years as a ranch hand, and then as a horse trader, and had come north because he had been looking for something, though he had been less than clear with himself about what that something was. She told him about Ohio, where she had grown up, about her father's hardware store and her mother's peonies, and the way the Midwest had felt too flat and too finished after a while. She told him about Thomas in the way you tell someone about a person who mattered very much and is gone, honestly but without drama, acknowledging the love and the loss with the plain straightforwardness of someone who has had time to make peace with it. She told him about the decision to stay on the homestead after Thomas died, which she described as half stubbornness and half not knowing what else to do. "That sounds like courage," he said. "It sounds like stubbornness," she said. "Those can be the same thing," he said. She looked at him across the table. "You're not what I expected," she said. "What did you expect?" "I'm not sure," she said honestly. "Someone with less to say, I think." "You are very quiet in general." "I am," he agreed. "I mostly don't have anything worth saying. And tonight," he looked at his hands, then back at her, "tonight there is a great deal worth saying." She felt the warmth in her chest again, the one that was not quite frightening anymore, the one that had been getting gradually less frightening for 25 days. "Tell me something else," she said. "Something I wouldn't know from looking at you." He thought about that for a moment. "I can read," he said. "I mean, I can really read. Books. I carry 3 of them in my saddlebags, and when I finish them, I trade them for different ones in whatever town I am passing through. People look at me and they think, there is a man who does not read books, but I read them. Shakespeare mostly when I can find them, and natural history. I like to know the names of things." She stared at him. Then she rose and went to the small shelf beside the window and came back with a book and set it in front of him. It was The Merchant of Venice, its spine cracked and its pages soft with reading. He looked at it and then looked up at her with something in his face that she did not have a name for yet but would come to know very well later. Something open and surprised and grateful all at once. "Thomas didn't read," she said. "He was not a reader. He used to say he didn't need books because the world was his book, which I always thought was a very nice thing to say and also a convenient excuse for not reading." Roy laughed. It was the first time she had heard him really laugh, and it did something to her that she felt all the way through, like a chord struck on a piano that resonates in your ribs. "I should go," he said, when it was near 8 o'clock and the supper was long since finished and the coffee was cold, and they had somehow talked for 2 hours without noticing. He rose and took his hat from where he had hung it on the chair back and stood for a moment at her door. "Thank you for the supper," he said. "Thank you for the horses," she said. He smiled at that, a slow, real smile that rearranged his face in ways that were very interesting. "I have one more coming tomorrow," he said. "You already arranged it." "Before I knew you would invite me to supper," he said. "I arranged it 3 days ago. I will not bring another after that if you prefer, or I will if you need them. I mostly just wanted an excuse to think about you every morning." She stood in her doorway and looked at him standing on her porch in the evening dark and said, "Come back on Sunday for dinner." He came back on Sunday, and the following Sunday, and the one after that. The last horse arrived on the 31st morning, a fine black mare with a white sock on her left hind leg and eyes like polished coal, and Nellie stood at the gate and untied her and led her to the corral with all the others, and she was laughing softly to herself the whole way, because Roy Boone had said one more and then apparently counted to one on his own generous terms. She learned later from old Pete Brannigan, who told her not because it was any of his business, but because Pete had never met a piece of information he wasn't compelled to share, that Roy had been saving from his wages at the livery for the past 2 months and had spent almost everything he had. He had ridden out to 3 different ranches and the Army trading post 40 miles north to pick out animals he knew were sound and well-tempered, animals that would serve rather than trouble a woman working alone. He had arranged with a horse trader passing through to bring several more when he ran short of what was available locally. He had been waking before 4 every morning and riding out in the dark and riding back in the dark, and then working a full day at the livery, and doing it all over again the next day. Pete told her all of this in the tone of a man reporting a natural disaster, with the particular bewildered respect of someone who recognizes a significant thing without entirely understanding it. Nellie thanked him and went home and thought about it for a long time. On the following Sunday, Roy came for dinner as he had been coming for several weeks, and they had fallen by now into a comfortable, easy pattern of conversation that felt nothing like the polite and careful talk of new acquaintances, and a great deal like the talk of people who have known each other a long time in some important way that cannot be entirely explained by the actual number of weeks involved. He had started bringing things. The first Sunday it had been a jar of good molasses he had got from the store. The second Sunday it had been a newspaper he had saved for her because he knew she liked to read everything printed in it, including the advertisements. This Sunday he brought a coil of new rope because he had noticed on his second visit that her fence line rope was getting worn. He was useful, Roy Boone. He was the kind of man who looked at what needed doing and did it without being asked, and without making a point of it. He had, on his third Sunday visit, quietly replaced a board on her porch step that had been soft and slightly dangerous without saying a word about it until she noticed and said, "Did you fix that step?" And he said, "I had the wood," as though that fully explained it. She had fed him more than dinner. She had given him coffee and conversation and her genuine attention, which was, she suspected, not a small thing to give. And she had been watching him become less and less like a stranger each week, watching the careful reserve that he wore like a coat begin to come off in pieces, watching him become in her kitchen and at her table something fuller and more present than he was anywhere else. This particular Sunday he arrived, and she was standing on the porch because she had seen him coming up the road and had told herself she was simply there for air, and he came through the gate and up to the step and stopped, and they looked at each other in the afternoon light. "Nellie," he said. He had begun using her given name about 2 Sundays ago without either of them making any particular point of it, and the way he said it was its own small private thing. "Roy," she said. "I have been thinking," he said, "about something I want to say to you, and I have been trying to find the right way to say it, and I am not sure I have found it yet, but I am going to say it anyway because I think waiting longer is going to make me lose my nerve entirely." She sat down on the top porch step and looked at him. "All right," she said. He stood there with his hat in his hands in the particular stance of a man who has made a decision and is going to follow it through regardless. "I would very much like to court you," he said. "Properly, if you will let me. I know you are independent and I know you have managed very well on your own, and I am not proposing to change that. I'm just asking to be allowed to try to deserve your company, on a regular basis, in the proper way." The April afternoon was warm and sweet around them, and the horses moved quietly in the corral, and somewhere a meadowlark was doing its level best to make the moment more musical, which Nellie appreciated. "You have been leaving horses at my gate for a month," she said. "Yes. And coming to dinner every Sunday for 5 weeks." "Yes. That seems fairly regular," she said. He almost smiled. "I suppose it does." "Roy," she said carefully, "I am 29 years old and a widow, and I have 31 horses in my corral and a porch step you fixed without being asked, and I think I would like very much for you to court me properly." The smile came through then, the real one, the one she had first seen at supper over a cracked copy of Shakespeare, and it was every bit as interesting as she had remembered. "All right," he said. "Come sit on the porch," she said. "I have made a pie." He sat on the porch. He stayed through the evening. When he left at dark, he touched his hat to her at the gate the way he always did. But this time he also took her hand for just a moment in both of his, and the warmth of that was something she thought about for a long time after. The courtship, conducted as Roy had promised in the proper way, which in Harlow Creek in 1878 meant calling at the house regularly and being seen together at church and at community gatherings, lasted through the spring and into the summer. Josephine Hadley, who had appointed herself a kind of unofficial keeper of the town's romantic affairs, observed its progress with deep satisfaction and relayed updates to interested parties. Clara Briggs, whose concerns about drifters and propriety had been somewhat addressed by the evidence of Roy Boone's continued reliable presence and evident hard work, came around to a position of cautious approval. Roy had, in the meantime, negotiated with old Pete Brannigan a new arrangement at the livery that gave him a small wage increase and a proper room at the boarding house instead of the loft, which Pete had agreed to partly because Roy had, over the months, made the livery the best run it had been in 20 years, and partly because Pete was a practical man who could see which way things were going. Roy also, in May, brought Nellie to see a piece of land. He had not announced what they were going to look at. He had only said, on a warm Saturday morning, that there was something he wanted to show her if she cared to ride out with him. She had ridden Clover, the dun mare, and he had ridden his own horse, a brown gelding named Cole, who was considerably less handsome than any of the horses Roy had left at her gate, but who moved with the same quiet efficiency as his owner. They had ridden about 4 miles east of town, into a section of valley she knew only slightly, where the land flattened out and the grass was good, and a creek lined with cottonwoods cut across the landscape in a long, lazy bend. Roy stopped and she stopped beside him, and they sat on their horses and looked at it. It was about 120 acres, she estimated. Good grass, good water, a small stand of pines at the northern edge. The soil looked rich enough where the creek had been working it. There was no structure on it, but the land itself was sound. "There's a section available," he said. "Homestead claim. I have been making inquiries." He paused. "I have been saving." She looked at him. He was looking at the land. "Roy," she said quietly. He looked at her then. "I know what I am asking you to think about," he said, "and I am not asking you to decide anything today. I am only showing you so you know that I am thinking about a future here. Not just days and Sundays and dinners. A future." Nellie looked at the land for a long time. The cottonwoods along the creek were fully leafed out, shifting and shimmering in the light. A hawk turned in a slow circle above the pines. The whole 120 acres lay there in the morning sun, unclaimed and patient, waiting the way good land always waits. "It's good land," she said. "It is," he agreed. "You would need help breaking it," she said. "It's a lot of ground for one person." "I know it." "I have 31 horses," she said. He almost smiled. 26 would sell well in this county," he said. "They're good animals. They would bring enough to put up a proper structure and get a real start." She looked at him. "You planned that," she said. "I thought about it," he said carefully. "You gave me horses you planned to help me sell," she said, "to help start a life." I gave you horses because I wanted to, he said. The other part is just arithmetic. She looked at the land again and she thought about Thomas and about Ohio, and about the decision she had made 14 months ago to stay, which had been the right decision. She was more certain of that now than she had ever been, because if she had left she would not have been here when Roy Boone came through Harlow Creek on a drifting road heading south from somewhere in the north and decided to stay. Ask me a proper question, she said. There was a pause. The hawk above the pines turned its slow circle. The cottonwoods shifted. Nellie Cooper, Roy Boone said, and his voice was very steady for a man whose hands, she noticed, had tightened on his reins. Will you marry me? She looked at him in the morning light on that good piece of land beside a creek lined with cottonwoods and thought, this is what it feels like. This is what it feels like when something is right and real and yours. Yes, she said. I will. They were married in the Harlow Creek church on a Saturday in July by the preacher who smelled of tobacco, with its cracked bell producing its peculiar groan for the occasion, which everyone agreed was festive enough under the circumstances. Josephine Hadley cried and made no attempt to hide it. Old Pete Brannigan wore his Sunday coat, which had not been aired out recently enough. Clara Briggs brought a cake that was genuinely excellent. There were perhaps 40 people there, which was most of Harlow Creek and its surrounds, because in small settlements any good occasion draws people the way water draws travelers. Nellie wore a dress she had made herself from good blue cotton, and she had put wildflowers in her hair because Josephine had told her she should, and for once she had agreed to be advised. She stood at the front of the church and watched Roy Boone walk toward her in a clean white shirt, and a coat she had not seen before, and thought, with the clear and simple certainty that was her most characteristic quality, that she was happy. He stood beside her and took her hands and said his vows in a voice that did not shake even slightly, which she had expected from him and loved about him, and she said hers with equal steadiness, which he clearly had expected from her and was glad of. The preacher pronounced them married. Roy kissed her. Josephine made a sound that was probably a sob. The cracked bell groaned in distant celebration. The summer that followed was the hardest and most joyful of Nellie's life, which was saying something given the competition. They filed the homestead claim on the 120 acres, which Roy registered in both their names, a decision that Nellie noted and filed away as evidence of a character already abundantly evidenced. They sold 24 of the 31 horses to ranchers in the county, keeping the roan and clover and the black mare and old August and Roy's coal, and 2 of the others that Roy felt were most useful for the work ahead. The money from the horses was enough to hire 2 men from town for the summer to help break ground and put up a proper house. Roy designed it himself, which turned out to be one of several things he could do that Nellie had not expected, along with cooking a surprisingly good bean stew, and having a memory for poetry that meant he could recite whole passages of Shakespeare while they were working side by side, which she had found alarming and then endearing and then simply part of the landscape of him. The house they built was not large, but it was solid. It had 2 rooms on the ground floor and a loft, a good stone fireplace, windows that faced west toward the mountains, and a deep porch that ran along the front. Roy built the porch with particular care, which Nellie understood was because he knew she liked to sit on a porch and watch things, and she loved him for knowing it, and for not making any kind of speech about it but just building it well. They moved in before the first cold came, and the night they slept in the new house for the first time, with the land they owned all around them and the mountains visible through the west window as dark shapes against a starred sky. Nellie lay in the dark beside Roy, and felt the warm, solid reality of him beside her, and thought about the first morning she had walked down to her gate in her nightgown, and found a horse she didn't understand. "Roy," she said softly, he said the particular sound of a man not quite asleep. "The first horse," she said, "what was her name?" There was a pause. She could feel him smiling in the dark without seeing it. "I called her Morning," he said. "I named them all in my head when I was picking them out. Morning was the first one." "Tell me the names," she said. He did. all 31 of them in order. He had given each of them a name in his mind, private names he had never told anyone, names that showed the same quality of careful attention that characterized all of it: Morning, Clover, Cedar, Redrock, Grace, Blue. He named them all the way through until she was half asleep and warm and entirely, completely home. The autumn of 1878 brought with it the full reality of what it meant to work a homestead from the ground up, which was substantial and demanding and occasionally discouraging, but not, as Nellie had known it could be, crushing, because she had Roy, and Roy was the kind of person who, when things went wrong, simply assessed them and found the next thing to do. He was not cheerful in a relentless way that she would have found exhausting. He was steady, which was better. They planted a winter crop of wheat in the section of ground they had managed to break that summer. Roy built a proper barn and a proper corral, both of which he did largely himself with the help of a few neighboring men who came for a barn raising in October, which was an occasion of considerable community goodwill and also considerable quantities of Josephine Hadley's cooking. The barn went up in a day and a half and was as straight as anything built in that valley. The animals settled into the new place with the philosophical adaptability of creatures who have been well managed. Clover and the black mare and the roan took to the new pasture immediately. Old August moved somewhat more slowly in all things but appeared content. Cole, Roy's gelding, found himself a corner of the corral that he considered his own and defended it with a laying back of ears that discouraged all challenges. Nellie sold her old place, the small property where she and Thomas had lived, to a young couple who had come out from Kansas and were starting fresh. She went back once to collect the last things she had left there, walking through the empty rooms with the particular quiet emotion of a person in a place where one life has ended and another has begun. She stood for a moment at the kitchen window where she had once watched the horses in the corral in the evening light and thought what she had thought then, which was that she did not know what to do with herself. Then she picked up her box, the one with Thomas's watch and her mother's ring and the note that said, "Her name is Clover. She is easy with fences," and she carried it out to the wagon and drove home to Roy. By November, they had established something that felt less like a new start and more like a going concern. The wheat was in the ground, the barn was full, the wood was cut and stacked. Nellie had found in the county a woman who wanted butter and a man who ran a small hotel in the nearest larger town, 30 miles south, who wanted eggs and occasionally chickens, and she had worked out arrangements with both of them that would supplement their income through the winter while the land was resting. Roy, for his part, had been approached by 2 of the larger ranchers in the valley about helping with their horses in ways that his skills specifically suited: assessing animals, training young ones, advising on breeding. He had not given up the livery work entirely, but had reduced his hours there, which old Pete had grumbled about but accepted, because Pete was realistic enough to know that a man who has a homestead and a wife is a man who is necessarily less available than a man who has only a loft in a stable. In the evenings they sat by the fire and read, sometimes together and sometimes separately, and Roy read aloud when she asked him to, and she did the same. And sometimes they talked about what they were reading, and sometimes they sat in comfortable silence that was its own kind of conversation. She learned over those months the particular rhythms of him, the way he was quieter when he was thinking hard about something, and the way his hands moved when he was telling a story, and the way he always woke before her and was already building up the fire when she came down in the morning. She learned that he had a temper that he kept on a very short leash and managed with considerable effort, and that when he was angry, he went quiet in a particular way that was different from his ordinary quiet, a tighter, more controlled stillness, and that the right thing to do was to give him 15 minutes and then ask him what was wrong, and that this always worked. She learned that he was afraid of things, specifically that he was afraid of failing her, which he had told her on a cold November night with a directness that had made her throat tight. "I am not easy to fail," she had told him. I have a great deal of experience with difficulty." "I know it," he had said. "That is partly what worries me. You can manage without anything. I want to be more than something you can manage without." She had put down the book she was holding. "Roy," she had said, "you are the thing I did not know I was managing without. There is a difference." He had looked at her for a long moment, and then nodded, the slow nod of a man accepting something he genuinely needed to hear. Winter came down from the mountains with real seriousness in December and January, with cold that snapped the air and snow that lay on the ground for weeks, and the kind of blue days and white nights that make the Colorado Territory both beautiful and brutal. They kept the animals alive and the fire going and each other warm, and Nellie discovered that winter with someone is an entirely different experience from winter alone, which she had known before she experienced it, but which the experience confirmed in ways that went deeper than knowing. She told him, on an evening in January when the wind was working hard against the west windows, and the fire was very warm and Roy was reading, and she had been watching him for a while without him knowing, that she loved him. She had been aware of loving him for some time before she said it, in the way that you are aware of something true before you have occasion to speak it, and she said it in a straightforward way, the way she did everything, without preamble or dramatic framing. He looked up from his book and at her, and there was that expression again, the one she had seen in the dark that morning when he had stood at her gate without knowing she was watching, the open and unguarded thing, the hope without its armor on. "Nellie," he said. "I know," she said. "I wanted to say it." He set the book down and came to where she was sitting and sat beside her and took her hand, and she leaned her head against his shoulder, and the fire cracked and settled, and the wind pushed at the windows, and they stayed that way for a long time, not saying anything more because everything necessary had been said. He told her he loved her on a morning in February, when she was at the stove with her back to him, and he said it apparently to the back of her head, which made her laugh, and then he laughed too, and they stood in the kitchen laughing in the February morning, and it was one of the best moments she could remember. Spring came back to the valley in March, cautiously at first and then with increasing conviction, the way it always does in high country, putting out green shoots in sheltered places while the last snow was still on the north-facing slopes. The wheat they had planted was coming up. The 2 milk cows were giving well. One of the mares, the black one, was heavy in foal, Roy having arranged this in the fall as a practical investment, and she was due in April. Nellie was also, as it happened, due in late summer. She told Roy on a morning in March, standing in the kitchen with the early light coming through the west window and the mountains very clear outside it. She told him in the direct way she did everything, looking at his face and watching what happened to it. What happened to it was considerable. It was not quite the face of a man hearing something for the first time, because she suspected he had been quietly hoping for it and was fairly aware of the signs. But it was the face of a man receiving something he had hoped for, which is its own particular expression, more complex and layered than simple surprise, a mixture of joy and weight, and the gravity of understanding that something enormous and permanent has arrived. He crossed the kitchen in 2 steps and put his arms around her and held her with a care that was different from the care she knew, a more conscious and deliberate thing, as though he were already aware of being responsible for more than he had been a moment ago. "Are you well?" he asked, into her hair. "I am perfectly well," she said. "Good," he said, and then, after a moment, "Good." The black mare foaled in April, as expected, producing a dark bay colt with his mother's good eyes who was on his feet within the hour and causing trouble within the day, which Roy took as an excellent sign of character. Roy named him Drum because of the way he moved, and Nellie thought this was the right name. The summer of 1879 was better than the summer of 1878 in the way that a second year always is better than a first. The land was more familiar, the work more practiced, the routines more established. The wheat from the fall planting had done well, and they harvested it in July with 2 hired men, and considerable effort and satisfaction, and the number it produced was enough to pay for the seed for the following season and leave something over. Roy had taken on a regular arrangement with the Callahan Ranch, the largest spread in the valley, assessing and training horses for them 3 days a week in exchange for a fair wage that put their finances on considerably firmer ground. He was very good at this work, the best Nellie had ever seen around horses, with a patience and a reading of animal nature that she had watched with genuine admiration. The Callahan horses improved under his handling with a speed that even old Frank Callahan, who was not given to complimenting anyone on anything, acknowledged. Josephine came by one afternoon in August when the heat was serious and Nellie was on the porch in the shade, considerably larger than she had been in spring, and they sat together and drank cold water and watched the valley shimmer. "You are happy," Josephine said. It was not quite a question. "I am," Nellie said. "Good," Josephine said, in the tone of a woman for whom this confirmed something she has been working toward. "I always thought you had too much life in you to be alone." "I was managing," Nellie said. "You were," Josephine agreed. "Very well, but managing and living are different things." Nellie thought about this. "He is a good man," she said. "He is an excellent man," Josephine said firmly. "And he was a fool for that horse business. No sensible person in the world would have done it, but I believe I understand it now, and I think it was the most romantic thing that has happened in this county in 20 years, which is not saying a tremendous amount, but there it is." Nellie laughed. "Don't tell him that," she said. "He will be embarrassed." "I already told him," Josephine said. "Last week. He turned quite red." Nellie laughed harder. Their son arrived on a Wednesday morning in September of 1879, delivered by the midwife who came out from town, and who declared him a fine, large, healthy boy with an excellent pair of lungs and a fine head of dark hair. Roy, who had been in the yard doing absolutely nothing useful for several hours on the grounds that he was keeping himself available, was allowed in when everything was finished and the room was in order, and he stood beside the bed and looked at the child in Nellie's arms with an expression she had never seen on him before, something so unguarded and raw and full that she felt tears come to her eyes, which was notable because she was not generally a crying woman. He reached out and very carefully put one finger against the baby's cheek, and the baby turned toward it in the instinctive way of newborns, and Roy made a soft sound under his breath that was not quite a word. "He needs a name," Nellie said. Roy looked at her. "What do you want?" "I want you to choose," she said. "I have been choosing everything I think of for years. I want you to choose this one." He thought about it for a moment. "Thomas," he said, "for your husband, who built you your first house and deserved better ground than he got." She felt the tears come properly then. She pressed her lips together hard for a moment. "Thomas Roy Boone," she said. Roy nodded. "Thomas Roy Boone," he agreed. The baby, thus named, opened his eyes briefly and looked at neither of them with the profound indifference of someone who has arrived somewhere new and is still forming opinions about it. The autumn of 1879 settled over the valley with its usual gold and rust, the cottonwoods along the creek going brilliant and the grass drying to a warm brown, the mountains putting their first snow back on, the whole cycle turning with the reliable beauty of a world that does not require human attention to continue being what it is. Thomas Roy Boone became, in short order, the center of considerable community attention, because babies in small settlements are events of genuine significance, and almost everyone came by to see him and bring things and offer advice that was mostly not needed but was offered in good faith. Josephine came 3 times in the first week alone. Old Pete Brannigan came once, holding the baby with the exaggerated care of a man handling something explosive, and announced that he had the look of a future horseman, which Roy accepted as the highest compliment available from that source. Clara Briggs brought 2 more cakes, which was beginning to establish a pattern. Nellie recovered well and quickly, because she was constitutionally incapable of taking more rest than absolutely necessary, a fact that Roy dealt with through a combination of gentle remonstrance and quietly doing the things himself that she was about to do against all medical advice. He was very good with the baby in a matter-of-fact way that surprised people who had expected the usual helplessness of men around infants. He held Thomas with the same calm competence he brought to everything physical, and when the baby cried in the night, he often woke before Nellie and was already up by the time she stirred. "You don't have to," she said, one night in October, coming into the main room to find Roy pacing by the fire with a settled Thomas against his shoulder. "He wanted company," Roy said. "Go back to sleep." She stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at her husband walking slow circles in the firelight with their son asleep on his shoulder, and thought, with the clarity she sometimes had in the middle of the night, that this was what she had been working toward without knowing it. Not this exact scene, but this quality of life, this fullness, this sense of being exactly where she was supposed to be. She went back to sleep. The winter of 1879 into 1880 was cold, but they were better prepared for it than the previous year, with more wood and more food stored and a better chinked house, and the warm reality of a family of 3 inside it. Thomas grew and became more opinionated about things, which both his parents found, in their different ways, entirely reasonable behavior. Nellie read to him before he was old enough to understand words, because she believed in starting things early. Roy talked to him while he worked in the barn, explaining what he was doing, which made Nellie laugh when she overheard it, but which she privately thought was the right approach. In the spring of 1880, Nellie began a project she had been considering since the fall. She wrote a letter to a woman in Denver who ran a small school for teachers, inquiring about whether the woman knew of anyone who might want a position teaching in a rural valley settlement. Harlow Creek had no school of its own, and the children in the valley were getting their education piecemeal, from parents who had time and inclination, and whatever books could be obtained. Nellie, who had been taught by a proper school teacher and knew the difference it made, thought this was a solvable problem. It turned out to be a somewhat solvable problem, though it required several months of correspondence and the cooperation of various people, including Clara Briggs, whose husband provided a piece of land for the purpose, and Josephine Hadley, who organized the labor to build the schoolhouse, and Roy, who quietly contributed more of the actual building work than he ever mentioned in any community meeting about it. The schoolhouse, a simple but sound one-room structure with good windows and a decent board floor, opened in September of 1880, staffed by a young woman named Martha Price, who had come out from Denver with excellent qualifications and an evident willingness to be surprised by things. She was a success from the first day. Nellie felt a satisfaction about this that was different from the satisfaction of the homestead or even the baby, the satisfaction of having made something that was for everyone, which felt like a different kind of important. The year 1880 rolled on with the particular momentum of a life that has found its proper course. The wheat crop came in well for the second year running. Roy's arrangement with the Callahan Ranch had been expanded, and he had begun doing work for 2 other ranches in the county, which meant that he was now reliably earning more than they spent, which Nellie had not taken for granted a day since they had achieved it. Horses they had kept from the original herd were all working well. Drum, the black mare's colt, was 2 years old and showing every promise of being an excellent working horse. On a warm evening in August, Roy and Nellie sat on the porch after Thomas was asleep, the way they did most evenings when the weather allowed, watching the last light go off the mountains to the west. The valley was settled and still around them. The horses moved slowly in the pasture. The creek could be heard faintly from the cottonwood bend. "Do you remember," Nellie said, "what you said to me, that first night you came to supper?" "Which part?" he said. "You said every morning when you took a horse out there you felt close to something you hadn't felt close to in a long time," she said. "What was it you felt close to?" He was quiet for a moment, looking at the mountains. "This," he said simply, "just this, a place, a person in it, something that was mine or that I hoped might be." She reached across the space between their chairs and put her hand on his arm. He covered her hand with his without looking away from the mountains. "You could have simply called," she said. He turned and looked at her with that slow smile. "You told me that before." "I know," she said. "I keep saying it because you never give me a better answer." "The answer is the same," he said. "I'm not always a normal man." "No," she agreed. "You are not. I have 31 horses to prove it." 26 sold ones," he said. "I kept 5, she said. "The ones that mattered most to me." He looked at her. Which ones mattered most? She thought about it. "Mourning," she said. "The first one, and Clover, and the black mare, and the paint with the good markings, and the roan." "Rose," he said softly, using the name she had given the roan in her own mind and which she had told him about. "Rose," she agreed. The evening deepened around them. Inside the house, Thomas slept the deep sleep of a child who has had a full day and has no concerns about tomorrow. August, in the pasture, stood in his usual corner with the patience of an animal who has survived long enough to have made peace with most things. Cole stood near him in a companionable silence that characterized their relationship. The mountains went dark against a sky that turned from orange to deep blue to black. There was more that followed. The following spring, 1881, Nellie found herself with the now familiar certainty of a second pregnancy, which she announced to Roy on a morning in March again, because March in their life had apparently decided to be the month for significant announcements. He took this news with the same deep, layered seriousness with which he had received the first, and with a little less of the shock, and a little more of the pure gladness of someone who already knows what it means. Old August passed away that spring, gently, on a warm day in April, in the pasture where he had lived his last comfortable years, which was as good a death as a horse could have. Roy found him in the morning and told Nellie quietly, and they buried him at the edge of the pasture in the proper way. And Nellie stood there a moment and thought of all the mornings she had depended on that old creature's dependable and uncomplaining labor, and was grateful. Their daughter arrived in September of 1881, making her presence known with the same considerable efficiency as her brother, and she arrived on a morning that was clear and bright, the best kind of Colorado morning, as though the day had dressed itself for the occasion. She had Roy's dark hair and Nellie's green eyes and an expression of calm assessment from her earliest moments that made Josephine Hadley laugh and say, "She has her mother's face already." They named her Clara Jane, for Clara Briggs, who had brought enough cakes to feed a county and whose cautious approval had, over 3 years, become genuine warmth, and for Jane, which had been Nellie's grandmother's name, and which Nellie had been saving without quite knowing it. Roy held Clara Jane the same way he had held Thomas, with that same matter-of-fact careful calm, and he told her the names of things the way he had always told Thomas, explaining what he was doing when he did it, on the principle that children absorb everything around them whether or not they appear to be paying attention. Nellie watched this and thought what she had thought before, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Thomas Roy Boone, aged almost 2, was deeply suspicious of his sister for approximately 4 days, and then became her most attentive protector, which was a trajectory that made both his parents quietly happy. The schoolhouse was doing well. Martha Price had married one of the Callahan Ranch hands, a man named Ellis who had a modest property of his own and a pleasant face, and she continued to teach, which was fortunate because she was excellent at it. The school had 10 children in it by the fall of 1881, and there was talk of adding a room in the coming year. In the winter evenings, Roy and Nellie read by the fire with Thomas either asleep or playing quietly on the floor between them and Clara Jane in her cradle, and Roy still occasionally recited Shakespeare when the mood took him, and Nellie still occasionally pointed out errors in the newspaper with a force and precision that he found privately admirable. And they were, both of them, conscious of a life that had turned out to be more than they had expected and more than they had known to ask for. On a morning in December of 1881, Nellie came downstairs early the way she sometimes did, when the children were still sleeping and the house was quiet, and she found Roy at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, looking out the west window at the mountains in the early light. She poured her own coffee and sat across from him, and they looked at the mountains together in the quiet. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. He considered. "The first horse," he said. "I was thinking about the morning I brought her. It was cold. The stars were still out when I left town." "What was that morning like?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment, turning his cup in his hands. "It was like a question I was asking without knowing how to speak it," he said. "Every morning after that was the same thing, a question. I thought, if she keeps taking them in, if she keeps finding room for them, maybe that means something." "It meant I was a practical woman who did not waste good horseflesh," she said. "I know," he said. "That was also part of the answer." She looked at him across the table in the early light, with the mountains behind him through the window, and the sound of the children not yet up, and the fire crackling quietly, and thought of that first morning she had found a horse at her gate and walked down in her nightgown to look at it, not knowing yet what it meant or who had left it, only knowing it was a beautiful animal and someone had chosen it carefully. "Roy," she said. "Yes. I am glad you are not always a normal man." He looked at her with the smile she knew, the real one. "I know it," he said. "I am glad you left a horse at my gate every morning for a month before I finally asked you why." He reached across the table and she put her hand in his, and they sat together in the early December morning of 1881 in the Colorado Territory, on a piece of land they owned and had worked and would go on working, with 2 children sleeping above them and 5 good horses in the pasture, and a life that was theirs in every particular. And the mountains stood against the bright morning sky the way they always had and always would, patient and enormous and entirely indifferent to the small, significant human happiness occurring in their shadow. In the spring of 1882, they planted their 4th wheat crop, and it came up well. Roy took on 2 young men as part-time help on the property, which was now large enough to require it, and he trained them with the same quiet patience he brought to training horses, which Nellie had noted was in fact essentially the same process. The Callahan ranch work continued. The school added its 2nd room. Martha Price, now Martha Ellis, found herself also expecting a child, which gave her and Nellie a new topic of conversation when they met. Josephine Hadley came for Sunday dinner regularly, because she had been doing it for long enough that it had become simply a feature of their life together, like the mountains to the west or the creek bending through the cottonwoods. She sat at the table with Thomas on one side and Clara Jane on the other, and told them stories about the valley when it was younger, and about the people who had come and stayed, and the people who had come and gone, and about what it had been and what it was becoming. And Nellie thought that Josephine's stories were a kind of history that wouldn't be in any book and was worth keeping anyway. Old Pete Brannigan retired from the livery in the fall of 1882 and sold it to a young man from Texas, and Roy helped with the transition in the practical way of someone who knew where everything was and what it all meant, and wanted to make sure the horses in the county continued to be well served, which they were. Clara Briggs, whose husband had done well enough to build a 2nd house on his property for their eldest son, and that son's new wife, continued to bring cakes on occasions and to attend to the social welfare of Harlow Creek with the energy of a woman who has found her calling. She and Nellie had arrived at a friendship that neither of them had initially expected, and both had come to genuinely value, built on mutual respect and the occasional frank disagreement, which is the best kind of friendship. The valley filled in gradually over those years, the way valleys do in territories that are passing from raw to established. More homesteads, more families, a 2nd store, a proper doctor who arrived in 1883 and set up a proper office that smelled only of medicine and not at all of dental work. A telegraph line went in and connected Harlow Creek to the wider world in a new way. The railroad reached the larger town 30 miles south and altered the economics of everything in ways that were sometimes good and sometimes complicated, and always interesting to manage. Roy and Nellie managed these changes the way they managed everything, by talking about them thoroughly, and then deciding what to do and then doing it with whatever was needed. Whether that was stubbornness or flexibility, or the particular combination of both that their life had taught them, was usually what any real problem required. Thomas Roy Boone grew toward his 5th birthday in the fall of 1884 as a boy who was, by all reasonable assessment, himself in all the most important ways. Patient with animals, curious about the names of things, given to quiet attention and occasional surprising statements, and possessed of a stubbornness that could have come from either of his parents and probably came from both. He had Roy's way of going still when he was working something out, and Nellie's way of deciding a thing, and then simply being decided about it, which was a combination that Josephine declared would either make him a statesman or a catastrophe, and possibly both in sequence. Clara Jane, at 3, was an entirely different sort of person, loud and cheerful and social, and convinced of her own centrality to any situation, which was so different from either of her parents that both of them occasionally looked at her with the slightly bewildered admiration of people contemplating a natural phenomenon. She had Nellie's green eyes and Roy's dark hair, and an expression of benevolent confidence in her own importance that was hers alone. She had learned to sit on Clover, led by Roy on a lead rope, before she had entirely mastered walking on flat ground, which Nellie had registered some concern about, and Roy had managed with such calm competence that the concern had dissipated. The house had been extended by then, a proper 3rd room added on the south side for the children, with good windows and a wooden floor that Roy had laid himself over the course of a fall and winter, plank by plank, with the methodical patience that was his most characteristic quality. The barn had been extended too, and the pasture fencing improved, and the creek crossing on the property made into something proper and safe with a well-set ford. On the evening of their 5th wedding anniversary, July of 1883, Nellie and Roy sat on the porch as they had sat on so many evenings, and the valley below them was the same valley it had always been, and also entirely different because they were in it. 5 years, Nellie said. 5 years, Roy agreed. Are you glad you stayed, she asked. In Harlow Creek, when you first came through. He looked at her with that expression she knew as well as any feature of the landscape. Nellie, he said, I stayed because of you. There was nothing here that made me stay except the fact of you, and I did not even know yet what that would mean. I just knew that I had seen you in the dry goods store with flour on your arms, and I could not make myself leave the county. She thought about that. That is a very small beginning for a very large life, she said. Most large things begin small, he said. She was quiet for a moment. The mountains were doing what they did in the evening, going from gold to rose to purple in the way they had done since long before anyone was there to look at them and would continue doing long after. Roy, she said. The roan mare, she said. Morning, where is she now? He nodded toward the pasture. She is in the pasture, he said, where she has been since the day you kept her. She is the first one, Nellie said. She is. She is the whole story, Nellie said quietly. In a way, she is the question you were asking. He looked at her in the evening light. And you, he said, are the answer. She put her head against his shoulder, and they sat there together as the light changed, and the day wound down, and the children made their small evening sounds inside the house, and the horses moved in the pasture, including Morning the roan, who was 7 years old now and still as steady and smooth as the day she had arrived at a gate in the pre-dawn dark, and waited patiently for a woman in a nightgown to come and figure out what she meant. The cracked bell at the church had been replaced in 1882 with a proper one that rang clear and clean across the valley on Sunday mornings, and when it rang now, it rang for a town that was becoming itself, for a community that had built itself out of the particular raw material of people who had come looking for something and stayed to find it. Roy Boone had come through Harlow Creek in the winter of 1878 looking for something he could not have named at the time, something that was not adventure or gold or land alone, something more specific and more essential than any of those things. He had found it, and he had known he had found it, and he had done what a man of his particular nature does when he finds something he wants and doesn't know how to ask for. He had done the only thing he could think of that was both honest and useful, that was both argument and gift, that said everything he did not yet have words for. He had left a horse at her gate, and then another, and another. 31 mornings in the dark, 31 horses tied to the post with good rope, 31 small, careful notes about horses that were also, read in a certain light, everything a man is trying to say when he doesn't yet know if he has the right to say it. And on the 32nd morning she had finally asked him why, and he had told her, and everything that followed had been the answer to that question. The long, true, living answer that was still being written on the Colorado land they owned together, in the children sleeping inside the house, in the creak of the porch boards under their chairs, in the evening habits and the morning fires and the books read together, and the wheat coming up and the sound of the creek, and all the specific, particular, irreplaceable dailiness of a life that is exactly right. Nellie Cooper had come to the Colorado territory with a husband and high hopes and had buried both in the hard ground, and she had decided to stay anyway, and she had been right to stay. Not because staying had been easy or because the land had been what Thomas hoped, but because staying had been where she needed to be when Roy Boone came riding down the road from somewhere in the north, with everything he owned in his saddlebags, and a quality in him that she had noticed entirely against her will, and come in time to love without reservation. He had left fresh horses at her gate, one each morning, for a month. Beautiful animals chosen with knowledge and care, each one a small argument, a patient and wordless declaration from a quiet man who had not yet found his words but had found his purpose, which was to make her life easier and to be nearby while he did it, and to hope, without pressing the hope too hard, that she might eventually look up from her considerable competence and her practical widow's life and notice that someone very much wanted to be part of it. She had noticed. She had been noticing since before she acknowledged it, which was her own kind of honesty, the honest that knows before it admits. She had put a note in a box and laughed on a porch step and ridden a roan mare to town, and finally, on the 26th morning, risen before dawn to sit in the dark and watch a man stand at her gate without knowing she was there. And in that watching, she had seen the thing that mattered most, that he was unguarded and real and genuinely hopeful in the way only a person who has not been hoping for too long yet can be. She had asked him why. He had told her. And that, in the Colorado territory in the spring of 1878, was how Nellie Cooper and Roy Boone began what they would go on to continue for the rest of their lives. In that house, with its west-facing windows and its deep porch and its good stone fireplace, on that 120 acres beside the creek, where the cottonwoods turned brilliant in the fall, and the mountains stood patient and enormous at their backs, with their children and their horses and their books and their fires and their long evening talks and their early morning silences, and the whole warm, ordinary, extraordinary architecture of a life built together, day by day, from a beginning as simple and as improbable as a fresh horse left at a gate before dawn with nothing to explain it but the hope of a quiet man who had found the one place in the world he wanted to be.